Ooh, right. I just want to welcome you all from the committee. We've got another couple of lunch break sessions, but look out for this space. We're going to be sending out some links, some dates for evening sessions, which are going to be sort of easier to be, 50 minutes or so presentations on a range of topics that we think will be of interest to the membership. So, right, and now over to John. Next slide, please.
Um, Thanks very much, Jeremy. I think this is the part of it. I don't want to dwell too much on this because I think it would be really useful to look at some of these concepts in practice with what Jeremy's going to say. But to sort of really set the scene for what we want to do, we had a look as a committee over how we understand significance in understanding historic buildings, and we thought it was worth digging into those because it sparked a whole series of conversations that we were doing, and it lets us look at different case studies, different examples, and try and deal with some of the issues we face regularly in a much more practical way. So I think really to start off with, just a reminder that the way that English heritage protection is set up is based on a conservation approach, which is about understanding what's really important about a heritage asset or a historic place and seeking to protect that and enhance that. So rather than looking purely at fabric and how do we make something look like what we think it should look like, it's about what really matters. And that develops a whole vocabulary and a whole series of concepts that contribute to that. So English policy, and up to a point Welsh policy, and less explicitly Scottish policy, really looks to understand this value. And we can understand that in terms of heritage interests around archaeological interest or what a site can tell us about the past, historic interest, which is how we experience the past through an asset, and architectural and artistic interest, which is around aesthetic values, around sensory perceptions of it, around aesthetic pleasure and ideals. Now, what we find is that NPPF and NPS don't define those terms very well, except for archaeological interest. So, where we have to look for that is some underpinning guidance, which is primarily conservation principles, which was produced by English Heritage in 2008, and then guidance GPA2, which is Historic England's guidance that seeks to kind of map that conservation principles approach through into planning policy, which is really handy. So if we move on to the next slide, um, understanding historic interest, and these are the policy definitions and the conservation principles definitions, which very, very close. And again, the GPA2 definition is virtually the same. As the key thing is how we understand and experience past lives and past events. And really, this split of illustrative and associative values is really quite important. And illustrative is how we is. I mean, we'll come on to this in a minute, but I don't want to read through these definitions. But it's around how, in the present, we look at an asset, we experience an asset, and we experience the past through that. So if we move on to the next one, illustrative qualities, these are things like where we say this is a well-preserved example of an asset type, or where you look at an asset and you understand how it was used or how it was intended to function in the past, or how it relates to culture. Like all of these things relate to this church. Good example, which is in Dendron in Furness. It's a well-preserved example of a mid 17th century church. You can look at it and understand how that church is used and how it's been adapted to fit the needs of the past, and you can understand how it fits into a village life through being able to see that. It's related to evidential value, but it's different. There's a certain dependence on visibility or perceptibility. You've got to be able to see or experience that value for it to be valuable. So what that means is these values are quite sensitive to change, either to the asset or its setting. You can change how the asset appears or is experienced, and that will completely change how you experience the past through it. So if we move on to the next one, which is the associative qualities, the key indicators, if you say this this is this was designed by someone, this was related to someone. So we look at the high level bridge in Newcastle and Gateshead, and that's a Stevenson connection, it's a Hawkes and Crawshay connection, a connection to local industries, local engineers, local design. Or if you say this is the house where something happened, or in some cases the novel was based on. I think we've all seen the Jane Austen Pemberley, and I always completely forgotten the name of the house that it actually is based on. But that those links through literature, where people experience the past almost vicariously through something that's been written. Now, this is where it gets slightly philosophical, because those associations will always be there. So how much does this depend on you actually being able to experience it, or some manifest element? I mean, the way I would look at this is, if that quality isn't manifest, it's going to be pretty robust to change, because that spot will always be where that event happened. And if you can't really experience anything that's related to it at this point, then a change, a physical change, is not going to make much difference to that. On the other hand, if there is something there that's very clear, that brings that home, so you can say this is the street that somebody walked down when they were doing such and such, or this is a spot in this battlefield where such and such happened, or this is the room where this novel was written, and you can see aspects of that author's life, or a scene that was described out the window, that kind of thing. That is where that suddenly becomes very, very sensitive to change. So these are some of the things we want to look at. So I think, next slide. So I think here is where I want to hand over to Jeremy, and to have a look and understand how we look at these issues, how we deal with these issues, and how we manage them in a real life case. So
Yeah.
over to you, Jeremy.
Okay. Thanks, John. Right. Well, this goes back a while, Bletchley Park, and there are so many things that one can use to talk about um, associative and illustrative historical value. I did some work last year on Virginia Woolf's house at Monk's House, where built onto it is a room of one's own, which one would argue has sort of global significance for its association and the way it illustrates philosophy and thinking. But here we have something which I think is really interesting. It's a really positive way, I feel, of I really want to share this with you, because it might be stimulate some thinking and some debate that we could even follow up in a future session. But it's how this understanding of not just the fabric itself, but how it reflects the values associated with a site can play a really positive role in informing future change. So Bletchley Park really arose back in 2001, which is when I personally was jumping from the listing team in English Heritage to the characterization team. And it's a difficult case. It's a difficult place to approach at that point in terms of listing and designation, which I'll touch on in a second. The Bletchley Park Trust was in a very difficult place, in summary, and there was a need really to bring people together. There were so many different people involved in Bletchley Park and caring for it and loving it in different ways, but it was really important to sort of bring a lot of the people involved in Bletchley Park, who sometimes their interests and passions were in synergy, and sometimes they were quite difficult to reconcile, to bring people together to think about, well, what is the site and how does it actually reflect the key events that make it so significant. So to develop some public consultation on the overall cultural values, context and character of the site, and then to inform consideration of the extent to which the site as a whole informs and reflects these values, and then to sort of use that as a base for developing a master plan, above all to try and get some investment in the site, which was our big concern at that time when I was working with the regional team on this, to really get those ducks in a row before we would then sort of moved on to a detailed investigation. So we knew it would be an iterative process. It's not, we have to do, we have to sort of scratch our heads and think, oh gosh, can we get these buildings over the bar for listing? Next slide. Because listing the type of fabric that you've got at Bletchley Park presents, real challenges. The site was rejected for listing in 1993 by the English Heritage Historic Buildings Advisory Committee. It was rejected by the UK government for the shortlist for the UNESCO World Heritage Sites shortlist in 1999 on the grounds that, quotes, it does not offer enough artifacts for UNESCO. And so there were obstacles, if you like, to sort of how we could, there was, well, probably on a positive sense, there was a need to really engage with looking at the site as a whole. Now, we were looking at military sites at that stage. We had been since the mid-1990s. And one of the key things about looking at the approach to military sites we took was to look at them as a whole, to look at the buildings, but to look at their related archaeology, to look at the appropriate means of designation, if designation was an option, through listing, through scheduling, but also to look at conservation area designation, alignment with nature designation, that sort of thing. So the slide actually shows it's an aerial image of Stowe Mares in Essex, which is a remarkable First World War site that survives as a landscape, which I could bore you for hours about this landscape. But the key thing is that Stowe Mares had retained a lot of the huts that survived from the First World War. It hadn't survived the hangars. It hadn't got the hangars remaining. So it didn't really fall into that top eight sites in England that sort of fell out of the review we did of aviation sites. And there were considerable difficulties about what to do with a hut. Next slide. So absolutely paramount, really, was not to get lost in that sort of detail of what to do. For example, with, can we list a hut or a block? When you look at Bletchley Park as a whole, what you're looking at, top right, the situation in 2001 was that the mansion had been listed at grade 2. The site had been designated as a conservation area, as indeed was Stowe Mares before the buildings got listed there. And what you see in the site is this progression from the signals intelligence and the school, if you like, of specialist cryptographers, mathematicians, and so forth, numbering under 40, who first of all worked from out of the mansion, then started to expand out of the mansion. You can see there's a mansion at the top of the slide there. Into the huts, and then on a piecemeal basis, moving from the huts into the blocks. The decision taken to build the blocks being taken in spring of 1941. The huts and the blocks are completely standard. They're standard types of buildings that you would expect. I live in Cheltenham, and the Oatley site, a part of GCHQ, was built to exactly the same pattern of blocks as these. So absolutely paramount is learning to read the site as a whole. How does the surviving the landscape, the site layout, the fabric reflect the history and significance of Bletchley Park, the complexity of process and interrelationships between the diversity of different units that fulfilled the wartime mission and operations of GCCS? How can the resulting definitions, if you like, of character and significance be retained through continued adaptation or successive changes of use? What are the vulnerabilities, constraints, and opportunities offered by the site and its fabric? So we needed to engage in those issues really quickly, rather than possibly coming up with our negative view of whether they were over the bar in terms of designation. Right, next slide. So if you like, I'm going to really focus on the historic values because these are really critical for Bletchley Park. And we're looking really at a blend of the illustrative and associative. Now, all of you would have heard, obviously, of Alan, such behemoths as Alan Turing. But of course, Bletchley Park was associated with a remarkable range of people and intellects. Gordon Welchman, Dilly Knox, von Neumann, a huge amount of remarkable people. I'm not really going to focus on giving you a list of all of those individuals, other than to say that it's very much, it's very much part of almost a sort of, well, it's something that's grown in importance over the years, if anything. But we're looking at really at a sort of blend of the illustrative and associative. And it's difficult to unpick the associative values from the illustrative. So I'm going to sort of just really look at, although, rather than just look at the associative, I'm going to really focus on illustrative, and some of the associative, as you'll see, will come into it. So the next slide. First of all, that Bletchley Park, when one casts a mind over other wartime country houses and country house landscapes that had been developed for wartime use, it is, in fact, one of the most legible anywhere in the country, because you've got a late 19th century country house, but set within a parkland that actually developed from the early 18th century and is set within, in fact, a medieval park as well. In fact, it's interesting to note, you can just about make out an axis running sort of from bottom right to top left of the aerial image there. That's the axis to which the mansion responded in the late 19th century. On the other side of the mansion is a small lake, and that's the axis along which the huts were sited as well. So that axis still sort of runs through the site. And what's really important about Bletchley Park is the way that the landscape as a whole was used and integrated into how the wartime site functioned. So the lake, which you can make out sort of to the left, the sort of top left of the image, was a really important place for contemplation, people sitting around, relaxing. You can see it's open ground next to the lake, which was used for ball games. There were tennis courts. The senior management played great sort of significance on having sufficient areas in which to relax, to contemplate, and to play. It's regarded as very important. And next, so hopefully that gives you an idea. So first of all, there's that rather more sort of prosaic fact about Bletchley Park. It's hugely important. The next slide. But the thing that is hugely significant about Bletchley Park is as the birthplace of the information age. And I would personally argue that it's the gateway to the information age, to the understanding of the information age, in the same way that Sagres in Portugal is sort of the gateway to the age of exploration, or Iron Bridge to the industrial age. You see this historical sort of development sort of within the site. So you have the mansion where the first sort of group of under 40 cryptographers, mathematicians, etc., are living and working, but they very soon expand out into the stable buildings shown here as they were just before the war. Yeah, next slide. You've got, and then you've got this sort of movement of the, well, you have within the stable buildings, you have the accommodation of some of the early sort of mechanical machines, electromechanical machines. You have within the the stable buildings, you've got the development from late 1939 under Turing and Gordon Welchman of the bomb machines, named after the Polish bomber, but on the cutting edge of developments in algorithmic mathematics. You've got Hut 1, the first phase of movement out into the huts being Hut 1, which is shown in that in the image there, the weatherboarded hut, which was home for the very first bomb machines. And this is really what happens at Bletchley Park. You've got this sort of this ad hoc development, and suddenly it happens so quickly. The need to build more computing power. So the development into the Hut 11 group, which was planned in late 1940, built in stages from early 1941. You can see there. Next slide. And then if one sort of moves on to the other types of technology, there's the much older Hollerith machine technology, which dates actually from the late 19th century. But the Hollerith machines were really pretty critical and accommodated in one of the blocks, which is Block C. Think really of the fact that you had to sort of install enough Hollerith machines to afford a sort of a mass attack in terms of the ability to decrypt. But of course, it's that development from 1942, where you've got the bomb machines, and then the development from 1942 under Max Newman and the post office team headed by Tommy Flowers of the valve-powered Robinson and Colossus machines to speed up the breaking of the high-level Lorentz code, which is a very sophisticated step on from the Enigma machine. The Colossus 2 was delivered in June 1944, the world's first programmable electronic computer. And it was installed within Block H, which is the one illustrated here, which is the world's first, really. It's the first building in the world really developed in a bespoke fashion. So actually, this was one of the blocks which was planned and developed in a bespoke fashion to actually accommodate the Colossus computer, which makes it hugely significant in the way, of course, it illustrates its historical function and its global significance. The next slide. We can really think, sort of reflect, and obviously I'm going to send through some text as well after the presentation, so don't worry about reading all of this. But if one sits and reflects back on Bletchley Park in a sort of broader, sort of international sort of context, it obviously is hugely significant. What was developed at Bletchley Park really anticipated the post-war developments as set out here, built on the concept of the universal computing machine and artificial intelligence as developed by Turing in his famous 1938 article, and John von Neumann's work, which was published in 1946, built on his experience here, but also with the Manhattan Project, the concept of stored program machines. There is still the building at Manchester University with Turing and Max Newman sort of installed the Manchester Baby and the Mark I computer. But that actually is a late Victorian sort of room that wasn't sort of built bespoke in the same way that we have. So its historical association, I would say, is more significant than the way that it illustrates that historical significance, which is something so obvious when one looks at Block D at Bletchley Park. So, yeah, next slide. There are other sort of aspects as well to looking at value, and this is one that one could argue is more associational rather than something being illustrated within the fabric. Bletchley Park played an absolutely critical role, particularly early in the war, in terms of its cooperation with France and Poland in breaking the Enigma code collaboratively. But really hugely important, and beginning to and really touching on something which is significant in illustrative terms, is the fact that the agreement between the government code and CIfA school and the US signals intelligence authorities marked the first time in history that intelligence expertise and technology was exchanged between foreign powers. I did do some sort of thinking about, well, where else in the world does this happen? Well, actually, really nowhere, because a lot of the intelligence authorities elsewhere in the world were very much in a state of competition. The decision was taken to develop at Bletchley Park a site that was built around the collaboration between the different services, and also that separation of decryption from analysis, which is the fundamental sort of way that signals intelligence has been developed in the period since. So next page. Yep. So that really leads one on to thinking about how those values are reflected in the site itself. It's the most intact site in the world, which reflects the formative development to intelligence decryption and intelligence organization into modern day signals intelligence. It's the only site in the world which has such a range of structures relating to the birth and formative development of the information age. We'll see in a moment, but we've got this sort of extraordinary sort of progression of structures. The archaeology of the site as a whole tells you it's directly illustrative of this significance. The way that you've got this progression from the mansion and the buildings associated with the mansion to the huts and then to the blocks. It's hugely significant in that respect. And there's no other site in the world that sort of matches that. It's all happening here on one site. It's this blend of the fact that there was needed this sort of enormous processing power, and that grew and grew. There were so many outstations developed in relationship to Bletchley Park, and even an outstation at Washington, DC, that fed its information into Block D at Bletchley. And you've got this unique surviving combination of wartime buildings associated with a country house and its park, which again seems doubly remarkable, really. Right, next slide. Just a couple of images now, just to give you an idea, really, of the fact that in the slide on the left, at least on my left, you can see in blue the pond, and in black there are the early huts. So you can see the huts clustering around the mansion, and the stable yard just north of the mansion. The block phase was initiated in July 1941. You can see the blocks there in green in the center slide. And then sort of developing on the right-hand side is just a diagram that's sort of putting together, trying to sort of align the understanding of the different functions of Bletchley Park in terms of the signals intelligence, the information technology buildings, and of course the importance of communications, hugely important. And one needs to also bear in mind that what you're looking at here is a direct illustration of the fact that you've got this development from a school of specialist cryptographers, etc., as I said earlier, developing into a site that housed, well, where more than 10,000 people were working by mid-1944. So if we just go on to the next slide. Right, the key point here is that, and I didn't mention at the beginning, though it's sort of marked in great big claxons for me to remember, is that this process, what we're looking at Bletchley Park, is something that had to respond really quickly to issues raised by the trust, and to some extent a threat of quite a real threat then, actually, of the parts of the site being sold and developed for housing. So we had to act pretty quick, and we had to sort of get put together, articulate what we felt the historical significance of the site was. It's worth noting that the just before we were involved, there was a report submitted to the Bletchley Park Trust by a consultancy that said that there were no records surviving, and that therefore it was really hard, if not impossible, to date the huts and the blocks. Well, straight away, I got in touch with someone who went down to the National Archives, and we found within a week enough documents to be able to sort of date the huts and the blocks, and then put that into a context of how the theatre of war expanded, of how signals intelligence developed, and how computer technology, if you like, this type of technology developed in the, not just during the war, but from the late 19th century into the post-war period. So that was done quickly in order for us to then begin to think about how the site illustrates its historical significance and function. It also underlined the fact that there's this sort of, well, a Channel 4 series ended on Bletchley Park, ended with people sort of incinerating all the documents. It's something of a myth. There was also an absolutely mad myth that I think I could talk about actually the activities that went under Block D, which is here. What we wanted to do was get this investment, start to get investment into the site to sort of try and get things moving. And it was a really difficult phase for about a year and a half. But also at the same time, I was talking to our colleagues, Catherine Morrison, Linda Monkton, and others in the Cambridge office about coming to Bletchley to do a detailed survey. And that is then what happened. So it's again, I have to emphasize an iterative process. I knew full well that setting this out the stall in this way would there would be errors and things, and also things we didn't know, or things we thought we did know, or things we didn't know that we won't know, etc. That we wanted to come back to. So it was really valuable, and a hugely important part of the success of the project was down to Catherine and Linda and colleagues from the Cambridge office. I must emphasize that. And to colleagues in the regional team as well, who sort of who I was working with right at the outset. So this is just a plan showing Block D, which is the block which brought within it the signals, intelligence, and decryption for Air Force, Army, and for part of the Navy into one block, and a block of fundamental importance in the development of signals intelligence, an extraordinary structure one looks at. And we were looking then at the functions, but also to some extent, or to the extent to which those functions are still legible, which is, so you can see that plan there put together by the Cambridge office, the degree of alteration to rooms. Right, so next slide. So, phew, we're up to, we hopefully got some time for some questions, but I think that all I want to try and do is, I just wanted to give you sort of run through Bletchley, but it's not just about Bletchley, which is a really wonderful place, and it's really fantastic to have taken part in this project. But it's also a way in which possibly as buildings archaeologists or people who can look at the character of a whole place or a whole site and begin to set out a framework for how we could look at it, to be aware of the different sorts of source material that we've got, and inform a sort of a positive approach where we can then be aware of the importance of doing detailed recording, but that's something that we can't do immediately because it would take too long to set up. So I hopefully that was useful, and I can put together some information afterwards. But we do have time now for some discussion and some questions. So, yeah. Okay, Cara, so I think we can put things to the floor with some questions and some discussion.
Yeah, if anyone does have any questions or any comments that they'd like to make, feel free to pop up your hand or unmute yourself. I can see actually already Si's popped her hand up.
Hi, Jeremy. Yeah, really interesting. Thanks for that. I was just wondering, Did the location of the park play any part in its significance?
Yeah, the park was, it sat astride the main sort of London to Glasgow cable line. So if you think about the Victorian internet, it's very much it sat astride or next to the Victorian internet. If you think the Victorian internet comes into that, I don't know if you've ever been to Porthcurno Beach in Cornwall, but you go down to the beach and there's that hut with all those cables coming in from the whole planet. So the cable network was it was important to find a site next to the cable network. And of course, wireless communication was also hugely important, and wireless technology developed significantly during the First World War and in the interwar period. But I think one of the key reasons for why the site was chosen where it was A, it was up for sale, and B, it was next to the cable line.
We've also got Richard with his hand up as well.
Hello, thank you very much for that. Adding a little bit onto your theory and the approach to the holisticness of documentation and research, I thought I ought to just draw attention to the fact that UK government has now ratified the UNESCO Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage, and that therefore gives much more of a support to the methods that you've just been describing, the theory of them. And following on from that, ICOMOS, its International Committee on Intangible Cultural Heritage, has also produced a charter with practical guidelines. I'll put the link through to that because it's taken us a long time to derive this document because it applies internationally worldwide. But I think the Buildings Group and CIfA as a whole would benefit from appreciating the contents of this document. It's a very useful and practical document that promotes much more the study and appreciation of intangible attributes of cultural heritage that then fits into the tangible approaches of historical buildings and ruins and so on that we've had to date. I'll put the link through to that in the chat.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. Yeah, I think the intangible doesn't necessarily, I don't think it's emphasized particularly in English policy, but I found certainly in assessments in Scotland, it's definitely more kind of at the forefront of kind of what you're thinking about, like looking at military sites there and thinking about how it might contribute to how those sites, what's significant about those sites, I guess, and the way it can illustrate the use of the site and the loss of that if the change of use occurs, how that might affect significance. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is intangible, but when one thinks of the setting and the lake, for example, there are some fantastic accounts of people by people that worked at Bletchley of how important those bits of open space were around the buildings, and they talk about how they move around the site and also how people use some of the privacy afforded by some of the planting as places to be quietly contemplative. And of course, quite a few people were also mourning the loss of loved ones, as well as more sort of body activities like playing ball games. Sort of baseball was particularly popular and so forth. So
yeah, and that's all to do with storytelling, and storytelling is at the heart of intangible cultural heritage.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I think they are also classic examples both of illustrative value as understanding how you move through a site or a space and how you experience that, and how those historical values are reflected, and also in terms of the association, if there is some sense that actually these things happened here, and you can find a way of picturing that and evidencing that, or not so much evidencing but more visualizing that as you visit, those are the kind of things we should be looking for, and those are very much tangible, albeit not necessarily physical.
Yes, seeing how legible or re-experienceable that might be within the landscape now.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, that's something used with, I suppose all of us have used, or sometimes used an understanding of how you move through a site, be it a farmstead or industrial site or whatever, how that site was designed to afford movement and use of spaces efficiently or in other ways, which it's often, it's not either one or the other, is it? So you could see at Bletchley how the buildings developed in what might appear to be quite an ad hoc way, but around that axis of the earlier 18th century park, and afforded were developed in an ad hoc way in order to sort of enable as efficient as operations as possible, but also throw an awful lot of light on probably getting into the feel of how the site was experienced, its experiential values, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess one thing to emphasize on that, and kind of with historical interest, is the fact it's something tangible that can be experienced now, isn't it? Without recourse to I guess kind of intrusive research or kind of unpeeling, just kind of distinguishing it from archaeological interest, if you will.
I think as we discussed the other day, it is that distinction between what we don't know yet, which is the archaeological and evidential value, and what we do know and how we relate that back to how we understand the past, which is the historical. So it's if you know about these associations, if you know about these uses, then that becomes a quite clear historical value, because you are interpreting that as you are experiencing it.
And that could be enhanced through on-site interpretation and things like that to make it more readily understandable, couldn't it, for members of the public, or
all sorts of interventions that don't necessarily relate to interpretation directly, but allow you to sort of better reveal those aspects. So, for example, clearing out elements, clearing out an overgrown ditch or something like that lets you see where things happened and how they happened.
Richard has his hand up again. You're muted, Richard.
Just extending that, I was wondering whether, given the role of Bletchley Park in the digital age, whether part of the new interpretation is going to be using AI. Are there opportunities there that we need to be grabbing?
Ask AI to interpret the significance of the site.
Well, and its stories, and the way that I'm from the dinosaur age. 13 and 14-year-olds who are much more competent on computers than the likes of me are going to be progressively using AI in all their activities, whether it's schoolwork or entertainment.
It's interesting. I think at the moment, having tried using various forms of AI for various different things, I think they're very good. It's a tool like everything else, and you have to have that human thought behind what you do with it, and what comes out is related very much to what you ask it to do. And clearly, if you're looking at imaginative reconstructions, imaginative understandings, that's great. It's good at doing that, sometimes a little bit too imaginative. On the other hand, where does that direction come from, and what is the purpose you're using it for? So clearly it's a tool. There's a space for it. People will use it. How that is going to be used is going to depend very much what you want to use it for, And I think, as we can see in a lot of planning circumstances, there are very clear requirements to say what AI has been used for. And certainly that's something where that kind of transparency and that understanding is going to become really important. But that's a whole new place to go, whole kind of worms that maybe
the place that I think which is just very inviting to how you I mean, if you think about it, that you had this 38 or so people developing to a place of 10,000, the processing power, you needed a whole site, a whole place, and the outstations, and including a couple in Washington to enable to get sufficient power to processing power onto the issue of decryption, which was enabled by some of the algorithms, etc., fed into the system by human intelligence, if you like. Turing wrote an article on artificial intelligence in 1938. I think it's a hugely inviting place to sort of think about those issues, and of course, my train of thought's gone. Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, I think it's like this gateway to the information age. I mean, if you think about the processing power, sorry, that's what I was thinking of. It's you know, it now fits into your phone. Just a bit of your phone takes up what Bletchley Park had. So it's an archaeology.
Yeah. And Bletchley Park is the best in the world for extending that past to the future with of the digital technologies and computing technologies. You can't get better. It's effectively a World Heritage site.
I think it is, personally. Yeah. Are any more questions?
No.
Ooh.
I thought it might be worth just mentioning quickly. I think sometimes it's kind of drawing away from everything we've done and going back just to the idea of historic interest. And you often see this misinterpreted as history. So you'll see like historical interest sections, say, in reports, and it will focus on this is the history of the site. And we need to just ensure that it could relate to that if the site fully illustrates those aspects of its history, but you need to kind of interpret, well, what's important within that history? How is that illustrated by the site, or how is the site associated with those key aspects of its history? Is it still recognizable to the people who lived there in a certain time period? Yeah, that was my only thought, just from the thing we built on, just kind of reiterate that. I think there's some good Historic England guidance on it that came out last year. I'll drop that in the chat for people.
Yes, indeed.
So sorry, that's just build. Here we go.
A question from P. Emery to everyone. It's a good question, which is to what extent does analysis of the intra-site arrangement of specialized functional spaces reveal any hierarchy of status of those functions? Is there, for example, any suggestion that there was an intention to foster a collegiate equality between specialisms? Yes, that is something worth thinking of. You do see aspects of that in the site, sometimes rather prosaic things. So in Block D, there are a lot of lavatories in Block D. One reason being that it was important for people from different parts of Block D not to communicate with each other. In terms of fostering collegiate equality, yes, there was this determined decision by Denniston, who's in charge of GCCS for the first part of the war, to very much a drive by him to ensure there was sufficient open space and places. There was pressure to build on the site of the tennis court. He said absolutely not. But there were hierarchies. There definitely were hierarchies at Bletchley Park. And I think probably there's an awful lot of grunt work at Bletchley that had to be done, particularly by the Navy Wrens in terms of operating the machines. And to some extent, you see that in the when you think of the number of people that were working in those extremely hot rooms, like sort of that some of the the bomb rooms or the Colossus machine rooms were very probably pretty hot and sweaty places in which to work, and that's very different from being perhaps a specialist sort of cryptographer or mathematician working in the mansion or in the cottage. So yes.